You probably think you woke up today as a purely rational, modern human being. You likely checked your phone, poured your coffee, and navigated the morning under the assumption that you operate according to the clear empirical laws of science and common sense.
Right.
But the truth is, the way you experience this very morning, the way you view your physical body, and the way you understand your place in the universe it is largely dictated by a 3,000-year-old ghost story.
It absolutely is.
The laws you obey, the art that moves you, the invisible boundaries of your social life, and even the vivid, terrifying landscapes you traverse in your sleep. These are not solely your own creations. You are walking through a reality woven together by invisible strings, and the hands pulling those strings belong to ancient subterranean myths.
It is a profoundly destabilizing realization when you first confront it. I mean, we operate under this immense collective assumption that humanity has somehow outgrown its mythologies. We like to believe we have traded the primitive campfire stories of our ancestors for the cold, hard, illuminating light of empirical reason. Yet when you look closely at the foundational structures of our modern consciousness, the very parameters we use to define what it means to be a human being, or how we relate to the natural world, you find that they are completely saturated with ancient mythological architecture.
They never left.
Exactly. The myths did not vanish when we built telescopes and supercomputers. They simply changed their garments and moved inward, dictating our lives from the shadows of the unconscious.
And dragging those shadows into the light is precisely our mission for this deep dive. Welcome. Our intention for this exploration is, frankly, extraordinary. We are going to embark on a comprehensive journey through a monumental volume of thought, a book titled Mitos, Sonhos de Religion Myths, Dreams, and Religion.
Phenomenal text.
This remarkable work was edited by the legendary comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell, and our goal today is to journey through the core insights of every single chapter of this collection. We are unpacking the work of 11 brilliant scholars, theologians, psychiatrists, orientalists, and philosophers who gathered to confront the severe crisis of the modern soul.
And to understand why these brilliant minds felt compelled to gather, we really have to understand the specific affliction they were trying to cure. In the preface of the book, Joseph Campbell diagnoses a fatal flaw in modern human existence, which is the affliction of extreme, paralyzing specialization.
The silos of knowledge.
Precisely. We have partitioned human knowledge into such incredibly narrow, isolated corridors that we have lost the ability to communicate the totality of the human experience. And Campbell shares a highly revealing anecdote to illustrate the sheer tragedy of this fragmentation. He recounts a time detailed by the great psychiatrist Carl Jung regarding Jung's interactions with Albert Einstein.
Which is just, the image of these two absolute titans of the 20th century sitting in a room together is striking. You have Jung, the master mapper of the human psyche, the deep-sea diver of the collective unconscious, and you have Einstein, the man who is literally redefining the physical fabric of space and time.
And yet, what happened when they tried to speak to one another?
They couldn't.
Right. Jung possessed no natural aptitude for higher mathematics. And Einstein, possessing perhaps the greatest mathematical mind of his era, found himself utterly incapable of translating the elegance of relativity into a language that a brilliant non-mathematician could comprehend.
Wow.
Jung recalled feeling terribly insignificant in the face of Einstein's struggle to explain his universe. But the tragic irony is that later, when Einstein asked Jung a question regarding psychology, Jung experienced the exact same barrier.
Roles reversed.
Exactly. Einstein could not grasp the psychological depths Jung was describing. The specialization was so absolute, the depth of their respective fields so incredibly isolating, that true, profound communication across that boundary was rendered impossible.
It is a terrifying thought when you scale it up to the whole of society. If the two greatest minds of the century cannot bridge the gap between the inner world of the soul and the outer world of physics, what hope do the rest of us have? We become isolated inside our own little domains of expertise.
We find ourselves alone in a universe of our own making. And that is the founding problem this book attempts to solve. To combat this terrifying fragmentation, the Society for the Arts, Religion, and Contemporary Culture brought these diverse scholars together.
To find a common tongue.
Yes. They convened across their specialized galaxies to speak on one unifying universal language that predates all of our modern disciplines, which is the language of myth and dream. Their goal was to shatter the walls of specialization and synthesize a complete, unified image of modern humanity.
To begin this synthesis, though, we really have to confront the specific mythological trap that you and I and everyone in the modern Western world is currently caught in.
We assume we are free of myth.
We do. But as the philosopher Alan W. Watts points out in his opening analysis, we are entirely governed by one. It is a myth so deeply embedded that it dictates our entire relationship with reality.
It does. And Alan W. Watts presents a thesis that will completely alter how you view our societal structures. He argues that the fundamental model of the universe in Western civilization, the bedrock of our common sense, our judicial systems, and our institutions, is patterned directly after the ancient despotic monarchies of the Near East.
The universe as a kingdom.
Precisely. We have inherited a cosmic image where the universe is essentially a political monarchy. God is envisioned as the King of Kings, a supreme, detached commander, imposing order upon a chaotic world from a position of absolute external authority.
Watts highlights a common morning prayer from the Anglican Church, which perfectly distills this operating system. The language addresses the divine as a King of Kings, Lord of Lords, the only ruler of princes, asking this sovereign to look down from a throne upon the inhabitants of earth.
It is the exact linguistic posture of a professional court flatterer.
Exactly. Seeking favor from an absolute despot. And the crucial point Watts makes is that even if you are entirely secular, even if you reject all organized religion, this monarchical framework still dictates how you perceive your own existence.
It dictates it profoundly because this framework carries a complex set of sub-assumptions that we accept as self-evident truths. And the most pervasive and damaging of these is the metaphor of clay, which is derived from the creation narrative in the book of Genesis.
Right.
In this mythological image, the material world is essentially an artifact. It is constructed. The fundamental assumption here is that matter, the physical substance of the universe, the dirt, the trees, and indeed the physical flesh and bone of your own body, is inherently dumb, passive, and inert.
It's just a featureless lump.
Exactly. It is a featureless lump of clay. In order for this dead matter to take on any intelligible form, purpose, or life, it requires an external spiritual force to impose its will upon it, to shake it from the outside in.
I want to pause on the psychological cost of this clay metaphor because it is staggering. It creates the ultimate unbridgeable divide between the mind and the body, between the spirit and the material world. It teaches us that our bodies are essentially biological machines that our minds are trapped inside.
A ghost in a machine.
Yes, and Watts provides a brilliant contrast to illustrate how strange this actually is. He points out that a child raised in the Western tradition will naturally ask their parents, "How was I made?" The very phrasing implies that the child views themselves as an artifact, something assembled from inert parts by an external creator, like a table or a robot.
And Watts contrasts this with the organic worldview of traditional Chinese philosophy. A child raised within that cultural framework would never ask, "How was I made?" The concept would seem absurd. They would ask, "How did I grow?"
How did I grow? That single shift in verbs changes everything about how you experience reality.
The distinction is the absolute crux of our modern psychological crisis. When you view yourself as something that was made, you inevitably feel like an alien in a world that you do not truly belong to. You are an external spirit inserted into a cold, mechanical universe.
You view nature as a hostile environment to be conquered.
Precisely. And Watts argues with tremendous urgency that we must radically transform this mythological worldview. We must transition from seeing the universe as a rigid, top-down monarchy to perceiving it as a magnificent, boundless pattern of dancing energy.
What does that look like in practice, though? If I view the universe as dancing energy, how does that change my Tuesday morning?
Well, it changes your fundamental relationship with your environment and your tools. In this new paradigm, you are not a stranger thrust into a mechanical world. You are an organic expression of the universe itself. It is much like an apple is an expression of an apple tree.
The universe peoples in the same way a tree apples.
Exactly. Furthermore, our technology must cease to be viewed as a weapon for conquering an alien nature. Instead, technology must be recognized as a natural, complex extension of our own bodies. Our communication networks are extensions of our nervous system. Our vehicles are extensions of our legs. We move from an ideology of conquest to an ideology of participation.
But I have to push back on this, or at least ask the question that naturally arises when you tear down a monarchical structure.
Yeah.
If we are shifting from a universe modeled as a monarchy, which, for all its strictness and despotism, at least provides a very clear sense of order, hierarchy, and definitive rules, to seeing the universe as dancing energy, doesn't that risk plunging us into absolute chaos?
That is the fear, yes.
Right, because to someone raised to rely on the king's laws, dancing energy sounds incredibly vague. Without the king giving the orders, how do we avoid falling into meaninglessness and despair?
The vertigo you are describing is the exact definition of the crisis we are currently enduring. It is the void that opens up when a myth collapses, and it is exactly where Stanley Romaine Hopper's analysis in the book becomes vital.
He addresses this head on.
He does. Hopper addresses this terrifying crisis of the mythological consciousness. The transition from the monarchical myth to the organic myth is agonizing because it requires what Friedrich Nietzsche famously called the death of God. But Hopper clarifies that in modern times, when we speak of this death, we are not making a theological declaration about the existence of a creator.
What are we describing then?
What we are truly describing is the loss of our myth's external sky-dwelling literalness.
So the image of the divine commander looking down from the clouds simply no longer possesses any holding power over the modern scientific intellect. We have mapped the atmosphere, we have been to space, and we didn't find a throne.
And because Western humanity relied so heavily on that external authority for our sense of meaning, our moral codes, and our psychological security, its collapse leaves us in a state of profound despair. The protective external structures of the accepted myths have fallen away. Hopper explains that we've been thrown violently back upon ourselves.
We are suddenly entirely responsible for our own meaning.
Yes. However, Hopper's crucial insight is that the mythological consciousness did not simply evaporate when the literal heavens were emptied. The myth moved underground.
Into the psyche.
Exactly. It retreated into our unconscious minds. The despotic kings, the battling angels, the world-ending floods, these are no longer projected into the physical sky. They are now experienced as deep psychological archetypes. They are the metaphors, the neuroses, and the vivid dreams that bubble up from the depths of our own psyches.
So the challenge is internal now.
The challenge we face today, therefore, is not to mourn the loss of the external monarchy. The challenge is to recognize that the dancing energy of the universe is already ordered. It is not ordered by a dictator in the sky, but by a deep, organic, internal harmony that we can only access by turning inward through our deepest imagination.
So the mythological battleground has moved from the heavens into our own psychological depths. But if we really want to understand how deeply that old monarchical operating system was programmed into us, we cannot just look at the abstract philosophy.
We have to look at the source text.
Exactly. We have to look at the source code. We have to examine the scriptural foundations of the Western mind, their foundational texts that forged this consciousness. And this brings us to the profound historical analysis provided by John F. Priest and Amos and Wilder.
To understand our present, we must understand the radical historical divergence that created our specific psychological posture. John F. Priest meticulously details how the ancient Israelites executed a massive, unprecedented break from the mythologies of every surrounding culture in the ancient Near East.
Because prior to this historical moment, myths were almost entirely cosmogonic.
Yes, meaning they were stories fundamentally about the cycles of nature. They were narratives designed to explain and reflect the cyclical rhythms of the earth, the changing of the seasons, the death of vegetation in winter, its rebirth in spring, the eternal repetitive return of agricultural life.
The ultimate goal was harmony.
The ultimate goal of these early cosmogonic myths was to ensure humanity's harmonious, unending coexistence with the natural world. Time was a circle.
But the Israelites did something completely different, something that shattered the circle. They historicized myth. They took the divine out of the recurring cycles of the seasons and placed it squarely into the linear progression of human history. Time became an arrow.
This was a monumental, world-altering shift in human consciousness. Priest explains that the ancient Israelites were willing to sacrifice their harmonious coexistence with nature for the possibility of a transcendent harmony, which they defined mythologically as the will of God.
So meaning changed completely.
Meaning was no longer found in the eternal, comforting return of the harvest. Meaning was now found in the historical journey of the community, moving forward through linear time toward a divinely promised ultimate culmination.
Think about the psychological weight of that shift. Suddenly, human events, military battles, geographical migrations, the passing of specific laws were elevated from mundane survival tactics to events of ultimate cosmic significance. History itself became the stage for divine action.
And this historical shift radically redefined the role of the dream. In our modern, highly psychologized world, we view dreams as internal phenomena. We view them as a private conversation with our own subconscious, a sorting mechanism for our daily anxieties.
The diary entry.
Exactly. But Priest emphasizes that in the Hebrew scriptures, a dream is never, ever viewed as mere internal psychology. A dream is a literal objective event where the numinous, the overwhelming reality of the divine breaks violently into the phenomenal everyday world.
To make this visceral, imagine the ancient view of a dream as a celestial telegram arriving at your front door, delivered by a blinding light. You don't psychoanalyze the telegram to understand your own neuroses or your childhood trauma.
Of course not.
You read the telegram to find out what the sender is commanding you to do tomorrow morning. The focus is entirely on the message being delivered, not on the psychic state of the person receiving it. The dream is the transmission of the will of God into the historical timeline, providing specific instructions, prophecies, or warnings that will dictate the historical actions of an entire nation.
The ancient perspective is strictly objective. When a figure in the Old Testament dreams, it is external revelation. But as we discussed with Hopper, we have lost the ability to receive those literal celestial telegrams. The sky has gone silent.
Exactly. And that raises a profound historical and psychological question. When the sky goes silent and the external authority structures crumble, how does humanity survive the loss of that direct external guidance?
We survived it by shifting the locus of revelation, a painful process that is vividly and terrifyingly illustrated when we move from the Hebrew scriptures to the early Christian era, as analyzed by the scholar Amos N. Wilder.
This is a fascinating transition.
It is. Wilder demonstrates how the New Testament's myth-making, its mythopoesis, was born out of a period of intense social trauma, marginalization, and absolute enemy.
The early Christians were a persecuted minority existing under the crushing, omnipresent, oppressive structures of the Roman Empire. The external world offered absolutely no hope, and the traditional religious and political institutions seemed either corrupt or powerless to save them.
In that environment of extreme rootlessness and physical danger, the psychological function of the dream and the vision takes on a radical, eschatological character.
Eschatological meaning the end of the world.
Right. Eschatology is the theological expectation of the ultimate, dramatic transformation of the world, the violent end of the current corrupted age, and the dawn of a new divine order. Wilder points specifically to the Book of Revelation to show how the mythological consciousness reacts to ultimate crisis.
The Book of Revelation is not a calm philosophical reflection. It is an absolute explosion of visionary, terrifying imagery.
Wilder brilliantly categorizes it as animated surrealism. It is a landscape of multi-headed beasts, dragons pulling stars from the sky, oceans turning to blood, and cosmic battles in the heavens. But we must understand the mechanism of why this surrealism was necessary.
It wasn't just hallucination.
Not at all. This eschatological dream was not madness. It was a highly sophisticated psychological weapon. It was a mechanism for survival.
But how does dreaming of a multi-headed beast save you from a Roman soldier?
Because the Roman Empire exercised not just physical tyranny, but psychological tyranny. Rome dictated the boundaries of reality. They dictated who had power, what justice was, and what the future held. To combat that, the early Christians had to construct a counter-reality that was larger, more powerful, and more permanent than Rome.
I see.
The visionary surrealism of Revelation breaks the psychological monopoly of the oppressor. By envisioning a transcendent cosmic reality where the monstrous beasts of the earth are ultimately defeated by divine justice, the marginalized individual achieves a sense of psychological victory and orientation.
They build a weaponized mythological landscape in their mind. The external world might be torturing them, but internally they are participating in the ultimate cosmic triumph. It is a total visionary restructuring of reality bubbling up from the depths of the human spirit in response to unbearable suffering.
The message was no longer just a telegram from a distant king dictating a historical maneuver. It was an eruption of archaic, primordial symbols of transformation, repurposed to give the human soul an anchor when the surface world was being torn apart.
That is a staggering realization about the sheer power of the human imagination. The myths that literally shaped Western history were forged in the fires of human desperation, serving as life rafts for the psyche.
They absolutely were.
But the biblical tradition, with its historical trajectory and eschatological visions, is only one half of the foundation of the Western mind. The other half is the classical Greek tradition.
Indeed. And if the biblical tradition shows us how myth operates in history, the Greek tradition provides the ultimate mirror for our internal psychology. This brings us to the profound explorations of David L. Miller, Norman O. Brown, and Owen Barfield.
We must look at how these ancient Greek narratives function not just as dead literature, but as active, living blueprints of our own modern minds.
When we casually examine the psychological legacy of the Greeks, we almost always focus on figures like Oedipus, representing our buried familial complexes, or Prometheus, representing our technological ambition. But David L. Miller presents a compelling, counterintuitive argument. He insists that the core archetype for modern rational humanity is actually Orestes.
Orestes. Why him?
Miller argues that the structure of our modern consciousness is fundamentally Orestian. To understand why, we must recall the impossible tragedy of Orestes. He is a man caught in an inescapable double bind. He is directly commanded by the god Apollo, the god of light, reason, and patriarchal order, to avenge the murder of his father. But to do so, Orestes must kill his own mother.
It is the ultimate moral paradox.
And once Orestes commits the agonizing act of matricide to satisfy the laws of Apollo, he is immediately and ruthlessly hunted down by the Erinyes, the ancient Furies. The Furies are older deities. They represent the dark, earthy, primal, blood-bound forces of maternal vengeance.
Miller is using this brutal ancient tragedy to perfectly map the modern human psyche. Think about how we operate today. We are, just like Orestes, violently torn between two massive opposing forces. On one side, we have our modern Apollo. This is our hubris, our soaring intellect, our reliance on cold, sterile rationality, our technological mastery, and our obsession with control and logic. We try to live entirely in the light of Apollo.
But on the other side, waiting in the shadows of our unconscious, are the Erinyes, the Furies. These represent the dark, earthy, primal, and fiercely repressed emotions within us. They are our unresolved trauma, our guilt, our untamed biological instincts, our grief, and our rage.
And because we try to live purely as intellectual, Apollonian creatures, we repress the Furies. But they do not go away. They hunt us down in our neuroses, in our sudden bursts of inexplicable anger, in our crippling anxieties, and in the terrifying dreams that wake us up at 3 a.m. We are Orestes, running from the consequences of our own severed nature.
Which is why Miller's analysis of the resolution of this myth is so vital. He uses the Oresteia to redefine the very nature of true psychological healing, or catharsis. In traditional, simplified literary theory, catharsis is often viewed merely as a purging mechanism.
Like blowing off steam.
Right. You watch a tragedy, you experience vicarious outpouring of pity and fear, you cry, and you feel temporarily relieved. It is essentially an emotional vomiting.
But Miller, applying a deep Jungian framework, argues that true catharsis is vastly more profound than just getting the bad feelings out.
True catharsis is not a purge. It is a vision of absolute completeness. In the climax of the myth, resolution is not achieved by Apollo destroying the Furies with his light. Resolution is achieved when the goddess Athena intervenes.
What's she do?
She conducts a trial, and her ultimate ruling is profound. She integrates the Furies into the justice system of the city of Athens itself. She honors them. She gives them a permanent home beneath the city, acknowledging that their dark, retributive energy is necessary for the balance and health of the society.
She doesn't banish the darkness. She gives it a constructive, acknowledged role. That is the ultimate psychological lesson for modern humanity. True healing, true salvation from our anxiety cannot come from using our intellect to further repress our primal nature. It comes from integrating our repressed earthly shadows with our conscious intellect. We have to welcome the Furies home. We have to invite them to the table.
This profound necessity of integrating the human intellect with the primal earth leads us seamlessly into Norman O'Brown's analysis of the myth of Daphne.
Right, Daphne and Apollo.
The myth is well known. Daphne is a beautiful nymph who is relentlessly, aggressively pursued by the god Apollo, who is inflamed with unyielding desire. Just as Apollo is about to physically capture her, Daphne prays to the river god for deliverance, and she is instantaneously transformed into a laurel tree.
In almost every standard reading of this myth, it is viewed as a tragic story of violation. It is the story of a being losing her humanity, becoming paralyzed and frozen in wood just to escape a predator.
But Norman O'Brown reads this metamorphosis in a profoundly different, radically mystical light. Brown challenges the assumption that becoming a tree is a degradation. He views the metamorphosis of Daphne not as a loss of humanity, but as the ultimate necessary spiritualization of nature and the humanization of nature.
How does turning into bark and leaves humanize nature?
Because Brown sees the myth pointing toward a profound teleological end, a vision of the ultimate destiny of humanity. He argues that our current state of being alienated from the earth, the clay metaphor we discussed earlier, where we feel like external spirits trapped in a dead world, is a temporary sickness.
And the tree is the cure.
Exactly. Daphne's transformation into the green evergreen represents a transfiguration. It is a prophetic image of a future state of bodily resurrection where the human spirit is no longer alienated from the material world, but is reunited in a state of perfect, indistinguishable unity with rocks, stones, and trees.
It is the absolute antithesis of the Watts clay metaphor. Instead of an external spirit hovering over a dead planet, the human spirit expands and merges until it becomes entirely indistinguishable from the living, breathing forest.
She finds eternity.
Yes. Daphne doesn't lose her life. She trades a limited, terrified human life for the vast-rooted, eternal life of the earth itself. Her transformation is the ultimate healing of the artificial divide between humanity and nature.
And this philosophical meditation on our alienated relationship with nature reaches its absolute zenith in the work of the philosopher Owen Barfield. The concepts Barfield introduces in this volume fundamentally alter how we view human history, biology, and our own daily experience of waking up.
This part is incredible.
Barfield builds his theory on a fascinating and rigorous distinction between what he terms ordinary and extraordinary consciousness.
We need to spend significant time unpacking this because once you grasp Barfield's distinction, you will never look at a tree or an animal or another human being the same way again.
Let us begin with ordinary consciousness. This is the state in which you, I, and everyone listening currently operate. It is the defining characteristic of modern humanity. Ordinary consciousness is defined by a rigid, impenetrable boundary between the inner world and the outer world.
The boundary of the self.
Yes. It is characterized by a strong, isolated sense of a central self looking out through the eyes at a world composed entirely of separate, disconnected objects.
It is the consciousness of absolute division. I am here inside my head, and the microphone is over there, and the tree is out the window, and we are fundamentally separate entities.
Exactly. But Barfield argues that this state is a relatively recent development in human evolution. Extraordinary consciousness, by contrast, is the primordial, original state of early humanity. In this ancient state, there is no sharp, agonizing division between the inner world of the psyche and the outer world of nature.
They weren't looking at objects.
Early humans did not look at a forest and see timber or separate biological objects. They experienced a deep, unbroken, participatory unity with the cosmos.
To make this tangible, think about the difference between how a 40-year-old adult and a 2-year-old toddler experience a walk in the woods.
That is a brilliant way to frame it.
The adult operates in ordinary consciousness. They walk through the woods and categorize. That is an oak tree. That is a squirrel. I am a human observing them. The adult is profoundly separate, but the toddler operates in a state much closer to extraordinary consciousness. The toddler doesn't have a rigid boundary of self yet. They feel fundamentally continuous with the dirt, the leaves, and the wind. They don't observe the environment. They are the environment.
That is a perfect analogy. Barfield argues that myth is essentially the historical record of humanity's collective, painful awakening from that extraordinary, unified consciousness into our current, fragmented, ordinary consciousness. And further, he proposes that a dream is the exact same process happening on a personal, microcosmic level every single night.
When you fall asleep, your rigid ego dissolves. You slip back into a state resembling that primordial, extraordinary consciousness where symbols, emotions, and realities blend together without borders. When you wake up, you painfully transition back into the separated, categorized, ordinary consciousness.
To illustrate this monumental historical shift, Barfield turns to the myth of the Sphinx. While modern psychoanalysis, heavily influenced by Freud, obsesses almost entirely over Oedipus's incestuous actions, Barfield argues that the true, world-altering key to the myth is Oedipus's encounter with the Sphinx.
The Sphinx is guarding the city, demanding the answer to a riddle before anyone can pass. The riddle is famous. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening?
And Oedipus correctly answers.
He says man. Because a human crawls as a baby, walks upright as an adult, and uses a cane in old age.
But look at the mechanism of what actually happens in that mythological moment. The moment Oedipus speaks that answer, the exact moment he verbally defines man as a distinct conceptual entity separate from the surrounding world, the Sphinx throws herself off a cliff and is destroyed.
The monster dies the moment humanity is defined.
Precisely. Because the Sphinx represents the ancient, monstrous, undivided, overwhelming unity of nature. By intellectually defining humanity as a separate category, Oedipus uses his rational intellect to sever the psychic umbilical cord connecting humanity to the earth.
Wow.
That mythological moment represents the exact point in our collective evolution when human consciousness separated from nature. It is the birth of ordinary consciousness. We gained our intellectual independence, but we destroyed our primordial connection to the cosmos to get it.
It is a profoundly tragic victory. But Barfield takes this concept even further, moving from abstract philosophy into the realm of our actual physical biology. He analyzes the terrifying image of Medusa the Gorgon monster with writhing snakes for hair, whose sheer gaze turns any living man into solid dead stone.
It is one of the most horrifying images in antiquity. But Barfield suggests that this myth might not just be a psychological metaphor for fear. He proposes that the image of Medusa might actually be an archaic, symbolic memory of the physical convolutions of the human brain forming over millennia of evolution.
The writhing, contorting snakes, solidifying on her head, represent the physical gray matter of the human brain, consolidating and complexifying out of the primordial energy of the universe.
Yes. And consider the power of Medusa's gaze. What does the gaze of Medusa actually do? It turns fluid, living reality into solid, dead stone. Barfield argues that this is exactly what the highly evolved logical intellect does.
It freezes reality.
Exactly. The logical brain, ordinary consciousness, looks at the fluid, interconnected, dancing energy of the universe and freezes it. It categorizes it. It turns living processes into dead, separate, petrified objects that can be manipulated.
I want to linger on this because it is absolutely breathtaking. The idea that our ancient myths are effectively the deep biological memories of our own physical and psychological evolution, preserved in the symbolic imagery of monsters and gods. The intellect is the Gorgon's gaze. When you label a tree lumber, you have used your intellect to turn a living process into a dead object. You have petrified it.
It perfectly illustrates the profound weight of these mythological symbols. They are not historical artifacts collecting dust in a museum. They are active, ongoing processes functioning within your nervous system right now.
I really want you to reflect on this tomorrow morning. When your alarm goes off and you slowly, groggily pull yourself out of the chaotic, boundless, boundaryless landscape of your dreams, in those first few seconds, you have to remember your name, you have to remember your job, you have to realize you are inside a physical body lying on a bed.
The transition.
That daily routine of waking up is not just a biological chore. You are personally reenacting humanity's slow mythological dawn. You are Oedipus, standing before the Sphinx, severing the cord and defining yourself as separate every single morning.
It is a profound responsibility, but this brings us to a critical, urgent juncture in our deep dive. We have established that the old literal myths, the sky monarchs, the celestial telegrams delivering the will of God, have lost their holding power for the modern rational mind.
Yes, the sky is empty.
We have awakened into ordinary consciousness, but as a result, we are isolated, alienated, and fragmented. If the traditional religious and political institutions can no longer provide the necessary psychological maps for our lives, who assumes that sacred responsibility? If the gods are silent, who writes the script?
Who is designing the metaphors we actually live by today? This leads us directly into a fascinating exploration of the artist as the new mythmaker. Since the theologians and the kings have lost the thread, the immense burden of meaning-making falls upon the creative artist. This transition is explored deeply by Joseph Campbell himself and by the psychiatrist Ira Progoff.
Joseph Campbell, synthesizing decades of exhaustive mythological study across global cultures, identifies 4 essential, non-negotiable functions that any living myth must fulfill in order to sustain a human being and keep a society from disintegrating.
4 pillars.
The tragedy of the modern era is that our traditional systems are rapidly failing to provide these 4 functions. We must meticulously examine these 4 pillars to truly understand the sheer magnitude of what the modern artist is now tasked with replacing.
Let's discuss what a human being actually needs to survive psychologically, according to Campbell's framework. Let's look at the first pillar.
The first pillar is the mystical or metaphysical function. This is the most foundational. A myth must reconcile human consciousness to the horrifying preconditions of life itself. And we must be honest about those preconditions. Life is built upon suffering.
It is inescapable.
Biological life requires that creatures consume other living creatures simply to survive. Sickness is inevitable, loss is guaranteed, and death is the absolute horizon for everyone. The first function of a working myth is to elicit a sense of profound awe before this terrifying mystery, and to guide the individual to say a deep, unconditional yes to existence, despite the inherent horror.
It makes life bearable.
It is the redemption of human consciousness from the paralyzing feelings of guilt, existential dread, and despair.
If a myth fails to do that, society descends into nihilism. People simply give up. What is the second pillar?
The cosmological function. A myth must provide a coherent, comprehensive image of the universe that aligns with the best science of the time, while simultaneously ensuring that every aspect of that universe is recognized as part of a sacred, interconnected whole. It gives you a map of reality.
So in the past, that map was a flat Earth with a dome of stars. Today, the cosmological function has to map onto quantum mechanics, black holes, and the multiverse. It has to take the terrifying vastness of modern astrophysics and weave it into a narrative where we still feel a sense of belonging, where the universe isn't just a cold, dead void.
Precisely. And that leads to the third pillar, which is the sociological function. This is the validation and maintenance of the specific moral order of a society. The myth provides the ethical framework, the taboos, the laws, and the hierarchical structures that allow a specific community of millions of people to function, cooperate, and cohere without destroying each other.
Even our modern secular laws, our constitutions, our concepts of human rights, these are fundamentally mythological constructs. They are shared fictions we agree to believe in to keep the society intact. And the final pillar, which Campbell argues, is the root of the other three.
The psychological function. A myth must guide the individual safely and meaningfully through the inevitable psychological stages of a human lifespan. It must provide the archetypal models and the rites of passage for moving from the dependency of childhood to the heavy responsibilities of adulthood to the physical decline of old age, and ultimately it must guide the psyche through the final portal of death.
This is where we see the most obvious modern failure. We lack coherent rites of passage. We have teenagers who have no mythological framework to guide them into adulthood, so they invent their own chaotic initiations. We have elders who are hidden away because we have no mythological framework that honors aging. So when the traditional religious and social structures fail to provide these four vital functions, where do we turn?
Campbell argues that we must turn to true art, but he draws a fierce, highly controversial, and highly specific line between what qualifies as true art capable of fulfilling these mythological functions and what is merely societal distraction. To make this distinction, he relies heavily on the aesthetic theory developed by the novelist James Joyce.
Joyce differentiates between what he calls static art and kinetic art. This is a crucial distinction for understanding how new living myths are actually born. Let's look at kinetic art first. Kinetic art is art that moves you to physical or emotional action. It is designed to push you.
Yes, and Joyce argues that kinetic art generally falls into two categories, both of which fail the highest calling of art. First, it incites desire, which Joyce categorizes broadly as pornography, and he doesn't just mean sexual pornography.
Oh, interesting.
He means any art designed to make you want to physically possess the object depicted. An advertisement that makes you desperately want a new car is functioning as kinetic pornographic art.
And the second category of kinetic art.
It incites hatred, rejection, or moral outrage, which Joyce categorizes as didacticism. This is art designed explicitly to make you angry at social injustice, to criticize a political regime, and to motivate you to change society.
Campbell and Joyce argue that both pornography and didactic social critique ultimately fail to elevate the human soul. They are kinetic. They keep you trapped in the mundane, transient world of wanting things and hating things. They keep you tied to the ego. True art, on the other hand, must be what Joyce calls static.
Static art arrests the mind. It stops you completely in your tracks. When you stand before a truly profound painting or hear a transcendent piece of music, it does not make you want to buy something, and it does not make you want to go out and protest something.
It just holds you.
It captures your mind in a state of profound, motionless awe in the presence of what is grave and constant in human suffering and human existence. It lifts you entirely above the exhausting polarities of good and evil, desire and fear, right and wrong. It connects you directly to the secret cause of all things.
That experience of static awe is the exact fulfillment of Campbell's first function of myth, saying yes to existence. It reconciles you to the horror and the beauty of it all simultaneously.
It is the pause button on the chaotic universe. But this perspective often meets resistance.
I absolutely have to push back on this, because it's a very harsh stance for Campbell to take. He essentially dismisses art that carries a political or social message as failing its highest calling. He lumped social critique in with pornography as kinetic.
Yes, he does.
But in a modern world filled with genuine cruelty, systemic oppression, and suffering, isn't fighting injustice a valid, necessary modern myth? Shouldn't the role of the artist be to hold a mirror up to society and motivate us to make the world better? Why is arresting the mind in static awe considered superior to actually alleviating real-world suffering?
It is a profound and vital objection, and it highlights the crucial difference between sociology and mythology. Campbell is absolutely not suggesting that social reform is unnecessary or that fighting injustice is wrong. What he is arguing is that social reform operates exclusively on the level of the changing variables of history.
The surface level.
Politics, economics, and the specific laws of a given decade are transient. They are the weather. They change constantly.
A political crisis in 1920 is very different from a political crisis in 2026.
Exactly. Myth, however, must connect you to the constants of human existence. The reality of death, the inescapable tension of opposites, the mystery of consciousness itself, these are the constants. They do not change whether you live in a democracy or a dictatorship.
I see the distinction.
If an artist only focuses on the kinetic variables of social reform, they may create highly effective political propaganda, and they may even affect positive social change, but they will fail to provide the deep psychological and metaphysical grounding that the soul requires to endure the absolute constants of existence.
It's the difference between treating a temporary symptom and nourishing the eternal root. Social reform might fix your laws, but static art gives you the psychological fortitude to face your own mortality.
True art provides the anchor in eternity, which allows you to weather the chaotic storms of history without losing your mind. And this brings us to Ira Progoff's contribution, showing exactly how an artist wrestles with this massive, terrifying responsibility.
Progoff looks at Ingmar Bergman.
Yes, Progoff analyzes the legendary filmmaker Ingmar Bergman to demonstrate how the symbolic dimension operates when the traditional external myths are dead.
Progoff illustrates how an artist like Bergman is forced to descend into his own psychological depths, specifically because the external heavens are empty. Progoff looks closely at Bergman's film Winter Light, which explicitly and painfully deals with the agonizing silence of God. The protagonist of the film is a priest who is suffocating because his traditional faith is completely evaporated. The external structures, the rituals, the dogmas, they provide absolutely no comfort to him anymore.
The old celestial telegrams have stopped arriving. The sky is a blank slate. And Bergman, acting as the true modern myth-making artist, does not attempt to artificially resurrect the dead god. He does not offer a cheap happy ending where faith is magically restored.
He doesn't look away.
Instead, Bergman fully embraces the excruciating pain of that silence. Through the rigorous, agonizing dialectic of his creative work, he descends into his own unconscious void.
He goes into the underworld.
And out of that painful, honest confrontation with the void, a living myth is born. What Bergman creates is not a new religious dogma to be imposed on the masses from above. It is a deeply personal, waking dream.
A symbolic truth.
Yes, it is a symbolic truth discovered in the darkest depths of the artist's own soul that somehow manages to radiate universal meaning for anyone who watches the film.
The artist acts as the shaman for the modern age. The shaman endures the terrifying psychological journey into the underworld on our behalf. They battle the demons of meaninglessness, and they return to the tribe with a piece of static art, a film, a painting, a novel that helps the rest of us say yes to our own difficult lives.
That is the exact dynamic of modern myth-making. But if the artist is the one forging these new living myths, creating the symbolic maps for our emotional survival, we are forced to ask a final, critical question.
What is the role of the philosopher?
Precisely. If philosophy is no longer just about solving abstract logic puzzles and analyzing language syntax in academic towers, what is its true, urgent vocation in a world starved of myth?
This question leads us directly into the final chapter of our deep dive, focusing on the insights of Richard A. Underwood. And Underwood completely redefines what a philosopher should be doing today. He flips the entire discipline upside down.
Underwood proposes a thesis that challenges the entirety of modern academic philosophy. He argues that the true, urgent vocation of contemporary philosophy is to explicitly fulfill the fourth function of myth that Campbell outlined, the psychological function.
The guide for the soul.
Philosophy must act as the guide, leading the individual toward profound spiritual realization and psychological wholeness. It must cease to be mere intellectual gymnastics and return to its ancient, original purpose as a therapeutic guide for the human soul.
To vividly explain how philosophy lost its way over the millennia and how it must return, Underwood uses a brilliant metaphor. the concepts of the upward and downward paths.
Historically, the trajectory of Western philosophy, beginning with the ancient Greeks, has been a relentless upward path. It was a deliberate, concentrated movement from mythos to logos.
Out of the dark.
It was a journey away from the watery, earthy, unpredictable, and chaotic realm of mythological symbols and bodily instincts. Philosophy sought to ascend upward toward the clear, bright, intellectual fire of pure reason, logic, and mathematics.
The Greeks, and the Enlightenment thinkers who followed them, desperately wanted to escape the darkness and superstition of the mythological cave. They wanted to stand out in the bright, unforgiving sunlight of pure, objective rationality.
And they succeeded, to an extraordinary, world-altering degree. That upward path gave us modern science, medicine, and engineering. But Underwood argues that today, humanity has traveled so incredibly far up that intellectual path that we have become dangerously unmoored.
We flew too close to the sun.
We have been burned by the cold, radiation-like fire of our own hyper-rational science and technology. We have lost our grounding in the earth, in the body, and in the soul. Therefore, the vital vocation of the contemporary philosopher is to deliberately reverse the trajectory. The philosopher must guide us on the downward path.
I love this concept. It is like the modern philosopher is a mission controller for an astronaut. Over the last few centuries, humanity has launched itself in a rocket of pure logic, straight into the cold, hyper-rational, frictionless vacuum of intellectual space. We are floating in the perfection of mathematics and technology.
But we cannot breathe.
Exactly. We cannot survive out there indefinitely. We are spiritually suffocating in the vacuum. The philosopher's job today is to calculate and execute a controlled re-entry. They have to bring us safely back from the freezing, abstract vacuum of space down into the warm, messy, watery, unpredictable atmosphere of the human soul. And they have to do it without letting us burn up on the way down.
That analogy captures the danger and the necessity perfectly. The philosopher must return us to the nourishing earth of our own unconscious, to the realm of myths and dreams. And to successfully perform this controlled re-entry, the philosopher must learn to listen to a completely different kind of voice.
Not equations.
They cannot rely on mathematical proofs. Underwood points back to the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who famously listened to the oracle of Delphi. The oracle did not speak in clear, logical syllogisms or empirical data points. As Heraclitus profoundly noted, the oracle neither declares nor conceals, but gives signs.
The oracle speaks in the ambiguous, multi-layered language of dreams, symbols, and art.
Yes. And Underwood argues that modern philosophy must learn to actively listen to the modern oracles. Those oracles are the signs bubbling up from our own chaotic dreams and the living myths being forged in agony by our artists. Philosophy must gather these signs, interpret them, and weave them into a framework that restores our shattered psychological wholeness.
Heraclitus warned that the vast masses of humanity sleepwalk through life, entirely unaware of the deeper forces guiding them.
And he urged us to awaken.
Yet, paradoxically and beautifully, he also recognized that even when we are asleep, even when we are lost in our private dreams, we are still actively participating in the unfolding of the universe.
We are arriving at the ultimate synthesis of this incredible volume. We have journeyed through the entire landscape of the modern psychological crisis.
We have seen exactly how the Western mind became trapped in a rigid myth of a despotic monarch manipulating dead clay.
We traced how our ancestors broke from the cycles of nature, historicized their myths, and relied on divine celestial telegrams to guide them.
We explored the Greek mirror, showing us our Arestian split minds and the absolute necessity of integrating our primal earthly furies.
We witnessed the collapse of those external, literal structures, and we recognized that the enormous, terrifying responsibility of providing the mystical, cosmological, sociological, and psychological maps for human survival now rests squarely on the shoulders of the creative artist.
The artist forges the living myth from the depths of their own suffering.
And the philosopher is tasked with interpreting those signs to guide us safely back down to the nourishing earth.
And what does this all ultimately culminate in? After thousands of years of human history, after all the theology, psychiatry, and philosophy, where do we arrive? Richard Underwood, citing the great philosopher Immanuel Kant, delivers the ultimate concluding thought of this entire massive undertaking.
Kant famously reduced human inquiry to three questions: what can I know? What ought I to do? What may I hope?
But Kant ultimately realized that all of philosophy, all of mythology, all of art, and all of science boiled down to one single profound and terrifying question.
What is man? That is the question of the Sphinx. That is the riddle we are continually trying to solve through our particle accelerators, our poetry, our laws, and our deepest dreams. Every single myth we construct, whether it is a king in the sky or a multiverse of dancing energy, is fundamentally an attempt to answer that question and find our specific place in the overwhelming cosmos.
Heraclitus said,
Oh,
even sleepers are workers and collaborators in what goes on in the universe. I want you to think about the immense, empowering weight of that statement. You are participating in the cosmos right now.
right now.
You are participating when you are awake, going to work, building the rational Apollonian world. But you are also collaborating with the universe when you close your eyes at night, dissolve into extraordinary consciousness and dream. The universe is not a dead mechanical monarchy that assembled you from inert clay. It is a magnificent, boundless pattern of dancing energy, and it is growing you. You are the universe waking up to ask itself who it is.
It is the ultimate question of modern responsibility. We are no longer passive subjects awaiting orders from a king. We are the active, conscious dreamers of reality itself.
And so I leave you with this final provocative thought to mull over tonight as you drift off. If the old gods have retreated from the sky and moved underground, if the universe is no longer shouting commands from the clouds, but is instead whispering to you through the surreal, animated symbols of your own mind, what will you do with the living myth that is taking root inside you tonight?
A beautiful question to end on.
Thank you for taking this profound, sprawling journey with us. We deeply appreciate you joining this deep dive into the labyrinth of the human spirit. Until next time, keep listening to the science.